The cold whips across the face. The wind roars as if the ocean itself protests against human stubbornness. And now the question, how did people who had neither compasses nor maps manage to cross the icy silence of the North Atlantic 5 centuries before Columbus? What made them risk go where there wasn't even the word America? And why, 1,000 years later, do archaeologists still argue where exactly did their journey end? In a land of fogs or in a land where grapes grow? The first threads of this story stretch from the end of the 10th century. Then the Vikings, descendants of Norwegian and Icelandic settlers, had already mastered the ice of Greenland. The saga tells of a man named Eirik the Red, an exile who found the Greenland and named it so not for truth's sake, but for hope's sake. Archaeological excavations in Broadaleave confirm, on this land indeed stood their wooden houses, warmed by hearths, and a belief that beyond the horizon lay something even greater. When the northern sea freezes like glass and the air cuts the skin, a Viking ship seems like a living creature. Its long body with curved sides is called a drakkar. This is not just a vessel, but a symbol of will. Light as a feather and flexible as a snake, the drakkar glided over the waves as if the ocean itself parted before its bow. It was on such ships that the Norsemen discovered not only Greenland, but also a new feeling, the taste of the unknown. This spirit pushed them further. In one of the accounts of Eirik the Red's saga, a young man is mentioned, Leif Erikson, son of that very exile. He heard of a land to the west from the merchant Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had drifted off course and seen shores unlike Greenland. And it was then that the Vikings first heard of a continent where no human foot from Europe had trod. The term that historians use to describe such journeys sounds like expansion, the movement of peoples beyond their familiar world.
But for the Norsemen, this was not a word, but a call of blood.
They did not write chronicles, did not build empires. They simply went to sea, because the sea called. The distance from Iceland to the coast of North America is about 4,000 kilometers in a straight line. But for them, this was not a straight line, but a chain of ice, fog, and stellar landmarks. Viking navigation was based on memory. They memorized the wind direction, the color of the water, the position of the sun, and the smell of the land. This method was called vector sailing. Modern researchers confirm, even without instruments, using only sight and intuition, they could travel thousands of kilometers with minimal deviation from course. It smells of salt, tar, and wet wool. The cold rings in the air, in the chest. There is no fear, only a thirst for the journey. Thus, at the end of the 10th century begins a journey that will change the history of discoveries long before Columbus. But for now, it is merely a shadow on the horizon, a land they have not yet seen, but already feel, like a call through the wind and the icy night. On the edge of Greenland, where even in summer the ice does not fully recede, Leif Erikson prepares his expedition, not for glory, but for truth, hidden behind the gray line of the horizon. The cold chills to the bone, and the waves thunder, as if the gods themselves test the resolve of everyone who dares to venture into the western void. And yet, he goes. But why? To prove that beyond the ocean there is land where one can live? A land where the grasses are greener, and the sun does not hide behind the ice. Archaeologists found in the layers of Greenland fragments of Norse tools, parts of drakkars, and even pieces of fabric woven from sheep's wool. These traces confirm that the Norsemen indeed built ships right on the icy shores. One of the found items, an iron anchor weighing about 20 kilograms, found near modern Nuuk. It became a silent witness to how the Vikings prepared their path to the west, to where their map ended, and fear began. The drakkar on which Leif sailed was about 20 meters long and accommodated 35 people. Its planks were fastened with iron rivets, and the hull was covered with tar so that it would not let in water. But most importantly, it was flexible. When the ocean struck it, it did not break, but breathed. Modern shipbuilders call this principle clinker-built construction, but for the Vikings it was the art of survival. It smelled of tar, sea salt, and campfire smoke. The men hoisted linen sails, checked the oars, sharpened their knives. Not only warriors sailed with them. Among the crew were carpenters, blacksmiths, and one priest to guard the soul from darkness. Sagas tell that animals were also taken on board. Goats, sheep, sometimes even chickens, not only for food, but to know when land was near.
If a bird released from its cage did not return, it meant that shore was ahead.
Here first appears a term that became a symbol of northern courage, volva. Thus was called a woman seer who could see the path in the future. Legends claim that it was the Volva who predicted Leif's safe return, but warned, the land you will find will not be paradise, but a trial. For the Vikings, prophecy was not a sentence, but a compass pointing to where destiny awaited. Cold waves crashed against the hull. Snowflakes settled on the sails, turning them into icy wings. Every movement of the sailors precise, like a hammer blow. They knew a mistake here cost lives. Their diet consisted of dried meat, grain, salted fish, and water in wooden barrels, which had to be heated with coals so it wouldn't freeze.
Archaeologists studying finds from Lonzo Meadows found charred bones and remnants of coal, proof that the Norsemen indeed cooked food on the new shores, using the same methods as at home. At sea there were no stars, only gloom and snow. Then an ancient art came into play called the sunstone. This was a transparent calcite crystal which could be used to determine the sun's position even through fog. Modern optical research has shown this stone could indeed aid navigation. It was their invisible compass, a tool that connected science and faith. The water turns dark, the sky low. Leif stands at the bow of the ship, clutching a rope, and the wind whispers, "Ahead, the unknown." Every wave could be their last. Every day, their last dawn. But ahead, there is a call. One stronger than fear, louder than the wind, older than the world itself. And when morning brings a faint glow in the west, no one believes their eyes. Land, a dark strip like a mirage. They move towards it as if to a vision, not knowing if death or salvation awaits them there. For at this moment, everyone understands. Everything left behind, the past, and ahead, a new history. A history that would later make scientists argue for centuries and ask the same question: who was the first to step onto American soil? The sea quieted. After weeks of storms and icy gales, the air suddenly became still, and a thin strip of green light rose above the horizon. Thus the Vikings first saw the land that would later be called Vinland, the land of wine. Leif Erikson stood at the bow of the Drakkar, gazing at the shore. He did not know that before him was the edge of a future continent. He was simply looking for a place where he could dry the sails, warm his hands, and hear the sound of birds, not the roar of waves. But it was this moment, when a man from a world of icy winds first saw the soft shore of America, that became the starting point of a new era. The saga tells that Leif and his men landed on 3 lands, which they named Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. Modern historians identify them with Baffin Island, Labrador, and Newfoundland. Archaeological excavations at Lonzo Meadows confirmed the Norsemen indeed reached these shores around the year 1000. There they found iron rivets, remains of houses with turf walls, and a smithy's forge, the first in the history of America. On this land, the air smelled differently, not of ice and salt, but of damp grass and berries. One of the warriors, according to the saga, said, "One can live here." The sun stood higher than in Greenland, and the earth felt warm even through their boots. They found grapevines, hence the name Vinland, although modern researchers believe these could have simply been wild berries. But for the Norsemen, this was a sign. The land was fertile, and that was enough to make their hearts stir.
When the Vikings built their first houses, they were surrounded by silence, not ringing as in the Arctic, but dense, filled with the rustle of leaves. They cut down trees with light iron axes called sayacs, short but sharp, ideal for work in the forest. For them, it was not a tool, but an extension of the hand. It was precisely such axes that archaeologists later found in the layers of the cultural horizon of Lonso Meadows, confirming every word of the ancient sagas. At night, they sat by the fire, listening to the crackling of tar. Sometimes, someone would say they heard voices in the distance, not the wind, but as if people. At first they laughed, then fell silent. Soon, they indeed saw others, people with copper skin, short, swift, agile. In the sagas, they are called skraelings, a word that means strangers or savages. These were, probably, the ancestors of the Inuit or other indigenous peoples of Canada. The first encounter was cautious, an exchange of gifts, fish, skins, but then fear. Contact with the skraelings became the first documented instance of two worlds, separated by an ocean, meeting. But for the Vikings, this was not the discovery of a civilization, merely a new trial. They did not know that they stood on the threshold of a continent that would one day change the fate of humanity. They simply survived. Sagas say that Leif called his settlement Leifsbudir, Leif's houses. These were low structures with sod roofs, reinforced with stones, so the wind would not carry them away. They extracted iron from bog ore, used furs to insulate the walls, and dried meat on wooden racks. Archaeologists confirm the found fragments of charcoal, ore, and iron slag correspond to technologies known in Norway at that time. Winter in Vinland was milder than in Greenland, but more dangerous, not from the cold, but from loneliness. People missed home, and the darkness, descending from November, drove them mad. Then a word sounded, more terrible than any weapon. Neath. Thus, in Scandinavian culture, they called the longing that eats away at the soul. Those who could not endure neath threw themselves into the sea or went into the forest. Some did not return. But even in this darkness, Leif remained true to his goal. He committed to memory every curve of the shore, every current, so that he could return, because he knew others would follow him. His voyage became not just an expedition. It transformed into the first documented crossing from Europe to America. When they hoisted their sails back in spring, the waves again crashed against the hull. But now, behind the stern, remained not just land. A legend remained. A land where people first proved the boundaries of the world are not a line on a map, but the limit of human resolve. And all that is needed to rewrite history is a step beyond the horizon, to where fear ends and the journey begins. Several years passed after Leif's return. His story of a new land, rich in forests and game, spread throughout Greenland, and soon another Norseman, Thorvald Eriksson, Leif's brother, decided to go further. His heart gave him no rest, for if Vinland existed, it needed not just to be seen, but to be settled. But this expedition would be the first where the Vikings would face not the sea, but people, and for the first time they would feel that the ocean was not the most dangerous thing awaiting them on the new continent. Thorvald set out with 30 warriors. They sailed on the same flexible drakars, but now armed to the teeth. Shields made of planks, spears, short swords, axes, and longbows. Every warrior knew. Now this was not reconnaissance, but conquest. Archaeologists found arrowheads and fragments of weapons in the layers of Lonso Meadows, traces of clashes that the sagas would later recount. The coast of Vinland met them with fog and the smell of damp earth. They built camps, fortified their dwellings, and walked along the coastline. One of Thorvald's companions recorded, "The land there is good, the water is clean, and the sun caresses the face." But soon the silence turned into alarm. From the forest appeared people, the very skraelings.
They came not with gifts, but with spears. The first arrow pierced the air, like a sign of the end. The battle was short and brutal. The Norsemen fought them off, but Thorvald was wounded by a spear in the chest. The saga tells that before his death he said, "It is good for me to die here. Bury me on this hill." His grave, according to legend, became the first European burial on American soil. No one knows exactly where it is, but archaeologists are still searching for this hill, comparing topography and data from the sagas. Then the Vikings understood. This land is beautiful, but it does not await guests. Their expeditions grew shorter, clashes more frequent, the journey home ever harder. Historians believe that within 20 years after Leif and Thorvald, there were several expeditions by Karl Sigurdsson, Freydis, daughter of Eirik the Red, and others. All of them tried to establish a permanent settlement, but each time they encountered the same thing: hostility and solitude. The term that modern researchers use to denote this phenomenon is liminality. This is a state between two worlds, when a person no longer belongs to the old but is not accepted by the new. This is exactly what the Vikings felt in Vinland. They could not return as they were before, and they could not stay. Sagas describe an episode when the Norsemen exchanged goods with the Skrælings, milk for skins, iron for fish. But one day someone raised a sword and the trade turned into a massacre. Historians believe that this conflict became the final blow. The Vikings understood. Without an alliance with the locals, they would not hold this land. And an alliance was impossible. Their worlds were too different. People died from wounds, diseases, cold. Winters in Vinland, though milder than Greenland's, were still merciless. Icy winds and constant moisture ruined ships, caused wood and fabric to rot. Moreover, iron supplies were depleting, and without blacksmithing tools, the Norsemen lost their main weapon against time. Archaeological finds confirm their forges fell silent, and their homes gradually turned into turf mounds. But even then they did not give up. The last known expedition was led by Freydis, daughter of Eirik the Red, a woman whose fury entered legends. The saga tells how, when enemies surrounded the camp, she snatched a sword from a fallen warrior, struck her shield, and cried, "Better death with weapons than life in fear." According to historians, this episode reflects the spirit of the Norsemen, indomitable, even in the face of inevitable demise. Freydis survived and returned to Greenland, but after her voyage, no one else dared to go west. Vinland became a myth, a place whispered about around campfires, but never returned to. And yet, its memory did not disappear. For centuries, the sagas were passed down orally, turning into legends, until in the 20th century, archaeologists found proof that it was all true. It was here, on the edge of an unknown continent, under the winds of Newfoundland, that the boldest chapter of Norse history concluded, but not history itself. Because the trace left by the Vikings outlived their bodies, their ships, and their fears, and quietly waited for its hour, when humanity would once again dare to look beyond the horizon. Centuries passed. The fire of Vinland's campfires had long since died out. The turf roofs had settled, and the dracars had rotted under the snow. The Vikings left, and the ocean, like an indifferent guardian, erased their traces. But memory did not die. In the cold sagas of Iceland, written 100 years after the events, lived the names of Leif, Thorvald, and Freydis. For their descendants, they became not just heroes, but a myth about people who dared to touch the end of the world and peered into a void where there were yet no maps nor gods of a new world. And only in the 20th century did the history, hidden underground, come alive again. In the summer of 1960, Norwegian archaeologists Helga and Anne Steen Ingstad found strange, grass-covered hills on the northern tip of Newfoundland. Local fishermen called this place Lonso Meadows. Beneath a layer of earth were hidden the remains of dwellings, a smithy, and wooden structures. Radiocarbon dating showed the age of the finds was about 1,000 years. This meant one thing: the Vikings had indeed been in America 5 centuries before Columbus. Archaeological reports confirmed the data from the sagas. Myth became fact. At the settlement site, iron rivets, charred beams, stone hearths, and traces of a metal forge were found. Among the finds were a fragment of a bronze pin, typical for Scandinavian women of the 11th century, and stone sharpening wheels. All of this spoke not of a temporary stop, but of a true settlement. Modern historians believe that Lonso Meadows was a base where the Vikings returned from the south after reconnaissance voyages.
It was a frontier, a boundary between the known and the unknown. Here a term comes alive that best describes this moment: apoxia. In ancient Greek, it means breath before the abyss. This can describe the state of the first explorers standing before a new world. The Vikings felt this apoxia, looking at the shores of Vinland, fear and excitement simultaneously. And it is this feeling, as modern psychologists of history believe, that drives every great discovery. The wind over Newfoundland sounds the same as it did 1,000 years ago. It carries the smell of salt, seaweed, and cold iron. Here, among the bogs and stones, one can almost hear the blows of the smith's hammer, the creak of wooden beams, the voices of people arguing about the way home. Lonso Meadows became a meeting point of science and legend, a spot where the word of the saga turned into archaeological fact. It was here that the world recognized America was discovered not by Columbus, but by warriors from the north. But the fate of Vinland remained tragic. Historians believe that a climactic cooling, known as the Little Ice Age, which began in the early 11th century, definitively severed the sea routes between Greenland and America. The Vikings left, and the ocean, like an indifferent guardian, erased their traces. But memory did not die. In the cold sagas of Iceland, written 100 years after the events, lived the names of Leif, Thorvald, and Freydis. For descendants, they became not just heroes, but a myth about people who dared to touch the end of the world and peered into a void where there were yet no maps, nor gods of a new world. And only in the 20th century did the history, hidden underground, come alive again. In the summer of 1960, Norwegian archaeologists Helga and Anne Stein Ingstad found strange, grass-covered hills on the northern tip of Newfoundland. Local fishermen called this place Lonso Meadows. Beneath a layer of earth were hidden the remains of dwellings, a smithy, and wooden structures. Radiocarbon dating showed the age of the finds was about 1,000 years. This meant one thing: the Vikings had indeed been in America 5 centuries before Columbus. Archaeological reports confirmed the data from the sagas. Myth became fact. At the settlement site, iron rivets, charred beams, stone hearths, and traces of a metal forge were found. Among the finds were a fragment of a bronze pin, typical for Scandinavian women of the 11th century, and stone sharpening wheels. All of this spoke not of a temporary stop, but of a true settlement. Modern historians believe that Lonso Meadows was a base where the Vikings returned from the south after reconnaissance voyages. It was a frontier, a boundary between the known and the unknown. Here a term comes alive that best describes this moment: apoxia. In ancient Greek, it means breath before the abyss. This can describe the state of the first explorers standing before a new world. The Vikings felt this apoxia, looking at the shores of Vinland, fear and excitement simultaneously. And it is this feeling, as modern psychologists of history believe, that drives every great discovery. The wind over Newfoundland sounds the same as it did 1,000 years ago. It carries the smell of salt, seaweed, and cold iron. Here, among the bogs and stones, one can almost hear the blows of the smith's hammer, the creak of wooden beams, the voices of people arguing about the way home. Lonso Meadows became a meeting point of science and legend, a spot where the word of the saga turned into archaeological fact. It was here that the world recognized America was discovered not by Columbus, but by warriors from the north. But the fate of Vinland remained tragic. Historians believe that a climactic cooling, known as the Little Ice Age, which began in the early 11th century, definitively severed the sea routes between Greenland and America. The ocean became deadly. Voyages ceased. The Greenlandic colonies gradually died out, and the path to the west once again closed with fog for hundreds of years. And yet, traces of their spirit remained. The technology of clinker-built ships formed the basis of shipbuilding in northern Europe. Navigation by the sun and stars became the prototype of future maritime methods. Even the word Viking transformed into a symbol of determination to go where there were no roads. Their journey changed not the map, it changed the perception of what was possible. When Columbus set out west 5 centuries later, he did not know about Leif Erikson. But his path repeated the northern route, from Europe across the ocean to a new world. The irony of history is that humanity had already been there, had already stepped on that shore, already knew that land beyond the sea existed, only it had forgotten. Today, a museum stands at the site of Lonso Meadows. Tourists walk on wooden boardwalks where once people in chainmail passed. One can hear the wind humming in the grass, as if in the strings of an old instrument. Every step on this land is like breathing through time. Here past and present merge, Viking and archaeologist, sword and shovel, legend and proof. Historians still argue. How far south did they go? To Nova Scotia? To Maine? Perhaps even to the Gulf of St. Lawrence? There are no answers. But one thing is known for certain. They were the first. Pioneers not merely geographical, but human. Those who taught the world that the ocean is not a wall, but a road. And when you stand on the windy shore of Newfoundland and watch the fog creep over the sea, a feeling arises as if somewhere out there, beyond the gray waves, one can still hear the thump of oars and the cry of a person who, 1,000 years ago, first saw America and said, "Land." 1,000 years have passed. The world has changed beyond recognition, but the ocean has remained the same. Its waves still crash against the rocks of Newfoundland, and the wind, that same northern wind, still carries the whisper of those who first crossed its icy heart. When archaeologists lift a rusty nail or a shard of pottery from the ground, these are not just finds, they are the breath of an era in which man first dared to go where there was no road. Today, Leif Erikson's name stands alongside Columbus's in textbooks, but their paths are as different as ice and sun. Columbus went for glory and kings, Leif for the sake of the journey itself. His voyage brought no gold, created no empires, changed no world economy, but it proved something greater, that man is capable of passing through fear and surviving in a world where there are yet no names. The term modern researchers use to designate such expeditions is pioneering. This is not simply the discovery of territory. It is the readiness to step where knowledge ends and faith begins. And in this sense, the Vikings were the first pioneers of modernity, not conquerors, but witnesses to the boundless nature of human will. Their story is not only about battles, cold, and ships. It is about how any discovery begins with an inner movement, with the desire to see beyond the horizon line, not an end, but an opportunity. Their dracars, built from bent planks and dreams, became a symbol that even the most fragile ship can cross the harshest ocean if it is commanded by a person who does not know the word impossible. Archaeologists continue to search for traces of new settlements. Every found fragment of wood, every speck of coal is confirmation that 5 centuries before European flags flew over the New World, Norsemen already stood here. Their steps on American soil were the first. And although their trace vanished beneath moss and snow, the fact itself remains. They reached it. And now a question for you, the viewer.
If you had lived in their time, would you have dared to go to sea, where every storm is a sentence, and every flash of light on the horizon, possibly a mirage? Could you have held the rudder when the wind lashed your face, and the whole world said, "There is nothing further"? The story of Leif Erikson is a reminder that boundaries exist only in the mind.
What the seas divided, hearts connected. And perhaps it is this that makes us heirs to those who once looked at the horizon and did not turn away. For as long as there are those who go further, the world will never become small.